can we be sure that the objectives that the states start with when they begin a conflict are the same as those that they end with? Objectives often change, and they often change for a number of reasons. So the objectives of a state can expand in the course of a war. They can expand in relation to military success. So Henry V, for example, when he lands in France, fights the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. When Henry V had landed in France, he had articulated an objective of taking the kingship of France, but he never really intended to get that. That wasn't why he was going to war. He regarded that as being an unattainable objective. It was really a bargaining chip. What he really wanted was to obtain British control over Aquitaine and other lands in France. But winning at Agincourt suddenly made it look like it was possible to achieve that grand goal he never thought was attainable before. And of course the reverse can be true, and you can see that, I suppose, in Afghanistan. Defeat can lead a state or group of states to redefine victory in ever narrower ways. And so in Afghanistan, over a period of time, you can see the way in which we've tried to narrow our definition of victory, shifting from very broad goals surrounding democratization, progressive social transformation in Afghanistan, and moving towards much narrower objectives. We redefine success basically to match the level of military victory that we've got. And you can also find in wars new objectives get activated by the very act of fighting. Classically, those are often goals related to credibility. Once you start fighting, or once indeed you introduce the prospect of war, what you tend to find is that issues like the credibility and prestige of a state suddenly become major objectives. And so often you'll find that wars continue because states are afraid of the consequences of stopping wars, because of the impact it will have on their credibility and prestige with other states. Often in that sense, war becomes self-sustaining. And the final point in terms of this issue of political objectives is the question of whether those political objectives are relevant. Can you win a war if you achieve your political goals, but those political goals won't work? So the war in Algeria in 1950s, early 1960s, the French achieved militarily their goals, but really the French were struggling against the tide of history there. Was there ever going to be a sustainable result? So can states win if they achieve goals that frankly are unsustainable? So there are problems there. Political objectives as a metric for defining victory creates all sorts of problems. What about this issue of cost-benefit analysis? Well, in many respects, that's no easier to use either as a way of defining victory, a way of determining whether you've succeeded or not. Cost-benefit analysis. Well, in relation to what? When you weigh whether war has been worth it, what are you judging it against? And one point of comparison would be whether fighting a war is better than not fighting a war, whether what you got out of a war would be better than not having fought that war at all. But the problem with that, of course, is entirely counterfactual. I mean, it's been done a lot. Some analyses of the Vietnam War have argued that even though the United States lost, it was still worth fighting because in the long run it helped sustain the credibility of US security guarantees to other allies. And in that sense, it was much better to fight than not to fight, because if America hadn't have fought, it would have created all sorts of costs in terms of that credibility. But would it? We don't know. So there are problems there with the counterfactual nature of assessing the costs and benefits of a war relative to not fighting a war. You could also judge the costs and benefits of a war in relation to your opponent. Have you come out of it better than they have? But there are a whole range of problems with that. Will they judge costs and benefits in the same way that you do? So will your analysis just be an exercise in ethnocentrism where you assume that they will judge costs and benefits in a similar manner to you, when in fact they might not? There are also problems in terms of of judging costs and benefits in and of themselves. If you're going to judge costs and benefits, how do you measure a cost and how do you measure a benefit? What metrics do you use? Military metrics are easier, territory, casualties, things like that. But war is non-linear. You don't necessarily get out of it politically what you put in militarily. It's entirely possible, as we know from looking at historical evidence, to win big victories in a military sense and not to get out from a war what you want to politically. So there's no obvious relationship often between military metrics and political success in the end. But what alternative metrics do you use? The campaign in Afghanistan demonstrates that there are a huge range of possible metrics. And there's also a problem in weighting tangibles and intangibles. How do you measure costs and benefits if you're measuring costs in terms of casualties and benefits in terms of things like honour, prestige, national credibility? So there is a basic difficulty there in measuring costs and benefits in terms of linking up tangibles and intangibles. In fact, the tendency is, because defining metrics is so difficult, tendency is to create often rhetorical metrics, metrics which sound good but are actually quite soft and are largely meaningless when you analyse them. So often in debates on strategy in Afghanistan, we've used words like initiative and momentum to try and judge who's winning. We know from looking at the campaign in Afghanistan just how difficult it is to come up with metrics that are in any sense objective, and often what happens simply is that individuals choose the metrics that support their argument, either whether you're winning or whether you're losing. So that's a big problem. It's the largest part of what I wanted to talk about. Using political objectives, using a cost-benefit analysis seems like an appropriate, rational, objective thing to do. It's actually very difficult to do indeed. There are three other quick issues there which I think are worth touching on and which further explain why judging victory in war is problematic. So you have difficulties in using your political objectives as a metric. You have difficulties in this cost-benefit analysis. There are other questions. Another key question is, what timescale do you use? And this is because something which looks like a victory at one point in time can look like a defeat or very close to it in another. So the First World War is a good example. 1918, from a British perspective, that looks like a pretty comprehensive defeat of Germany. It looks like victory. By 1939, our judgments of the value of the First World War and its outcomes, of course, is very different. The First World War looks much less like a victory and more like a pause, frankly. But if timescale matters, what timescale do you use? How long do you wait before you judge whether a war is a success or a failure? Because the longer you leave it, the more difficult it is to determine whether the state of events you have now is actually directly related to the war that you had, or whether other factors have emerged that have shaped events. So timescale matters, but it's not clear how long you have to wait before you can reach a firm judgment on whether a war has been a victory or defeat. So there are problems with the benchmarks that you use. There's problems with timescale. Another key question is, if you're judging victory, whose perspective do you use? We often use states, in the sense that we talk about Iraq's defeat, America's victory. We treat states as unitary actors. In practice, of course, judgments about victory and defeat can vary within states quite significantly. So, for example, the Paris Accords of 1973 pretty much put the seal on American defeat in Vietnam. But it wasn't a defeat for Richard Nixon, the US president at the time, who negotiated that settlement. Nixon had become elected on the basis of finding a political solution, on getting peace with some kind of honour that would get America out of Vietnam. So that Vietnam Peace Accord, the Paris Accords, was maybe a defeat for the United States, but represented in political terms a victory for Richard Nixon. And then my last point, because of the difficulties in scorekeeping, actually what a lot of people do when they judge victory and defeat in war is they match fix. Often what happens is that commentators have a perspective on whether a state has won or lost, and they shape the evidence to fit that perspective. Or to put it another way, victory and defeat is often as much about perception as it is about any kind of reality. So, for example, in the early 1990s, America's intervention in Somalia, that is pretty much categorically viewed as a defeat. But actually, if you look at the objectives at the time that animated this intervention, why is it judged as a defeat? The United States went in support of the UN as part of an attempt to provide humanitarian relief to Somalis. At least 250,000 Somalis' lives were saved by that intervention. So why do we view it as a defeat? And there are a whole range of things which shape our perceptions of war, the psychological biases that we have as human beings, our emotions, our desire for cognitive consistency, cultural factors. There are also issues to do with information. We often don't have all the information, or even very much information at all about a conflict, about what really has gone on there. There are problems associated with expectations. If we expect a significant victory in a war and we get less than we expect, that can often shape a radical shift to the other side to see it as a significant defeat. If we don't expect much from a war and we get a bit more, that can shape a perception of victory. Pre-existing mindsets can also be important. Partisanship is often an important factor in the way in which we shape our perceptions of events. So, for example, in 2001, if you were against intervention in Afghanistan, it's highly likely you're going to view where we are now as a significant defeat. If you were in favour of intervention in Afghanistan in 2001, it's much more likely you will search for metrics now which will sustain, if not a perception of victory, then at least a perception of having achieved something. And there's the impact also of salient events. There are some symbolic events that just seem to strike a chord, that seem to heavily influence our perceptions of victory and defeat. And if you think about Vietnam and the famous photograph of the last helicopter out of the US Embassy in Saigon, with people trailing off that helicopter, that looks like defeat. So these salient events can often be very important in summing up for some individuals whether or not a state has won or lost a war. And of course there are issues to do with manipulation by the media, by leadership, that all help shape perceptions of victory or defeat. So perception is crucial. But what complicates this even further is that there isn't just one audience. So perception matters, but the perception of which audience, so whose perception matters. And so in any war, there are going to be multiple constituencies involved in judging success or failure. There are going to be domestic audiences, there are going to be international audiences judging whether or not you've won or lost a war. And so there's a question there about whose perception matters the most. So the important point in relation to this match fixing issue is that evaluations of victory and defeat in war are often as much a matter of perception as they are about any kind of objective conditions on the ground. So what I've been trying to say is simply this. Victory matters. It matters for strategy, it matters for policy, it matters in a political sense. But judging whether a state has won or lost a war is actually hugely complex and often politically very controversial.